Okay, so we're live. Welcome, Maysa and Chuck. Thank you, Milos, for your help and everyone behind Cyber Sangha helping make this happen. My name is Alejandro Chaoul, and I'm going to be your host today. And for those who don't know, our great teacher, Lopon Tenzin Namdak, uh, recently, last week, passed away or went into paranirvana. And he is really the embodiment of this tradition of what are unlocking the mind, of dark retreat, of many of the practices that we'll discuss. And so I thought that a way to honor, and for those of us also who knew him, I've been very fortunate to know him for 34 years. I thought we'll have a moment of silence and I'll share some pictures of him. And with Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, he's one of his main students and the founder of Ligmincha as well of Cyber Sangha. So we'll start with that. I'll share my screen. Hmm. So, okay. So I know that for all of us who met Lopan, he's a wonderful. I was very fortunate to be there for his 100th birthday and have this and his thumbprint in the back. And so I keep it close to my heart. And so for those who are new to Cyber Sangha, welcome. Cyber Sangha is actually something that Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche created, and even before COVID. And he thought, why not bring teachings, bring dialogues to the whole world without boundaries and without cost or without money involved. And so we've done many teachings. Every full moon, we have a 24-hour meditation that starts in the States, but goes to Finland, to Colombia, to all the world around. And we're 24 hours in meditation in community. So Cyber Sangha is about that. Sangha means community. So the community that through now this technology, we can access and we can be together, whether we are in different places, like now with Maysa and Chuck and Milos. And so today, particularly, we're going to continue with some of our dialogues of science and spirituality, and we're calling it Unlocking the Mind, Psilocybin, Dark Retreat, A New Path for Well-Being. And I'm really delighted to have both Chuck and Maysa. I know them both for many years. Actually, if Maysa, I met when she was a student, a medical student here at UT. And it's great to see now that it's Dr. Alavi and that doing great work. And Chuck, I know for many years as well, from actually in connection with another colleague, Jim Duffy, and then we are together doing some dark retreat research and so forth. And interesting enough, now Maysa and Chuck work together as well. So this is fabulous. But I want to tell the audience a little bit about you a little more formally. So Maysa Alavi is a visionary physician leader dedicated to advancing the ethical and evidence-based use of psychedelic medicine. She's the medical director of Usona Institute, and she leads clinical methodology and safety strategy for groundbreaking drug development programs, including the 5-MeO DMT and the SIL 301, helping to shape the future of psychedelic therapies. She's also the founder and chief medical officer of the Center of Functional Psychedelic Medicine in New Orleans, where she oversees a multidisciplinary team providing ketamine-assisted therapy, functional medicine, cannabis education, and clinician training. Her hands-on experience includes serving as both site physician, as a study therapist in pivotal clinical trials for MDMA and psilocybin, and in the treatment of depression. She was trained here at Texas Health Medical Center in Houston, and then had residencies in Harbor, UCLA, and USC California Hospital. She's committed to emotionally intelligent care, innovative research, and the integration of consciousness medicine into mainstream mental health, and a wonderful human being. Maysa, Chuck, welcome.
Thank you. Honored to be here, Ale. Thank you for your impact on that journey, especially. I remember sitting in a room meditating with you and a handful of other students and thinking, okay, this is the beginning of something new. And I don't quite know what that's going to look like, but you were there for it. So,
Excellent. I'm
yeah.
so happy to hear that. And Chuck, Charles Raison, he's an internationally recognized expert in psychiatry, human ecology, and the science of well-being. He's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He directs clinical and translational research at the Osona Institute and leads behavioral health innovation at Vail Health. Chuck is pioneering research, investigates the novel mechanisms of depression, the mind-body connection, and the healing power of compassion. He has played a key role in developing psychedelic medicines as potential treatments for major depression, and his influential work has earned him global recognition, including being named one of the world's most influential researchers by the Web of Science for the decade of 2010 to 2019. His commitment to both scientific rigor, compassionate care has been honored by awards such as the Raymond Pearl Memorial Award and Emory's University Science and Spiritual Health Torch and Trumpet Award. And he's the co-author of The New Science, The New Mind-Body Science of Depression, a definitive text of the evolving science of mental health. Thank you, Chuck, for being with us again.
Of
And
course.
and it's so great to see you and see your impact. I actually never know where you are because you have positions in Colorado, in Madison, in Atlanta. So this must be part of your work of unlocking the mind, of being able to be in a few places at once.
I just teleport, Ollie. Yeah, I wish I could teleport. I'm mostly in Madison. I mean, one of the gifts, there's a lot of curses of the modern world, but the Zoom world, like we're doing now, allows me to do things that there's no way I could have done 10 years ago. You can sort of be connected with people. Although I will tell you that I was out at the psychedelic science meeting briefly in Denver, and I was walking down the street and I saw this guy. And I said, "Oh my God, I know this guy. I know this guy. I know this guy." He was looking at me. It was really awkward. And then all of a sudden he goes, "Chuck." And he goes, "You don't know who I am, do you?" And I'm like, "Oh my God, this is horrible." And I said, I know you, man." But it was a guy you may know, Moran Amit, who works with Lorenzo in the psychedelic work at MD Anderson. But I'd only seen him on Zoom,
Right.
and people look different in real life. So anyway, but yes, I have a Zoom presence here, there, and everywhere. It is true.
Excellent. So let's start a little bit. Some people like to know how you both got to where you are, a little bit of, the story of you as human beings interested in this world, and on your professional career. But I also always think, and I find that our professional and personal careers are so intertwined. Um, and also, what it's really marvelous is all these interconnections, as you were saying now, Chuck, you're working also with Lorenzo and other things besides finding family connections, and
Yeah.
and and with Maysa, as we were saying, from medical school. So let me start, Chuck. I'll start today. Sometimes I start from women and younger, or we start with has the one more career. Let me start today with you, Chuck.
So how did I get to do what I'm doing is the
Yeah.
question, I guess. Yeah. Well, I've been asking myself this question a lot. And in the last few months, I've actually started developing lectures where I actually, for the first time ever, I've kind of talked about my personal story. The short answer is, ever since I was a kid, I was, frankly, kind of inclined to sort of mystical experiences. And without quite understanding what I was doing, I always had this sense that there were certain states of mind and emotion that when you were in them, were wonderful in and of themselves. But then as I got older, I became convinced that they were also highly protective against depression, anxiety, right? There are states of this sort of transcendent gratitude that you can still grieve, but it makes it very hard to have the kind of colder, more isolated sense of depression, right? And I think that my career has been about sort of trying to explore ways to bring those states to bear upon something. And what I chose to bring to bear upon was depression. I've struggled with depression myself. I'm a good psychiatrist that way. And so, like, it's very true what you say, Ali, that a lot of what I do is directly related to my own experience. But I became a psychiatrist kind of late in life. And I was a full-time clinician at UCLA, not Harvard, but the main NPI. And what got me into research was actually Tibetan Buddhism. It was Tumo. I got into research because I became obsessed with wanting to understand Tumo, because I always had this sort of interest in how the body can, basically talks to the brain. And this idea that you can harness bodily energies to put the brain into these sort of more stable, sort of, blissful states was so fascinating to me that that's actually how it happened. And then, I decided I was going to go to Atlanta and go to Emory and dedicate my life to trying to understand this stuff. And I never did study Kumo. The folks that I thought could do it did not want to be studied by me. But it did lead me into this whole world. We began to look at the role of inflammation in depression, and because I had this connection with Tibetan Buddhist folks, Geshe Lobsang, for instance, at Emory, we did this work on compassion meditation, which then sort of over time led me into this career where basically I've spent the last 10 years looking at what I sometimes call ancient practices, these ways that have been discovered repeatedly across human history that produce generally immediate powerful effects on emotions, cognition that are very powerful, very positive. And can we find ways to responsibly bring them into the modern world to help treat depression? That's simply kind of what I've been doing. So, we've looked at meditation, and I've spent a good deal of my life studying heat. And of course, the heat goes back to the Tumo because it's a heat meditation. So I never did Tumo, but I managed to sort of into studying, basically sauna, hypothermia. And then in the last 10 years, psychedelics. Because of course, psychedelics are just so obviously, I think, an intervention that taps into consciousness, into conscious experience, and giving people experiences that are, when they're lucky, fortunately, but very profound, and that have these long-term beneficial effects. So that's really it. I sometimes say I've spent my life sort of trying to understand, consciousness-based psychopharmacology or pathways in the body that can be then harnessed to put the brain into certain places. But it comes out of my own experience for sure.
Great. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to dive into those. Maysa, want to tell us of your journey?
Sure. I think my path was an unlikely one. I have memories of going to the doctor as a young child and saying I would never want to be a doctor. And yet, through a proclivity for interest in health and wellness, I remember a time I diagnosed my own ear infection. I think my parents kind of saw that my life would take a turn and I would head into medicine. But I entered college as a business, cinema, television major at USC, sat in my first business class, and the guy said the company wasn't doing well, so we laid everybody off. And I said, this is not the right profession for me. I enjoyed my cinema classes, but I kept following my excitement. I think that's the thread through my life experience, is following my excitement has opened doors to opportunities that I thought would never be possible. So I kept taking biology and neuroscience classes, ended up double majoring in biology and neuroscience, and being pretty impacted by a college professor who was studying cocaine in rats and looking at what these dopaminergic systems were doing to feed forward, our liking habits. And when I decided to go to medical school, it was because all my friends were doing it, and my degree really lended itself to that. So I didn't quite know what I was getting into, and found the curriculum to be really challenging and not necessarily in alignment with the interpersonal aspect of wellness and healing I was looking forward to. I actually took a year off of med school to make sure I wanted to complete the degree program. And I knew that when I completed my studies, I would use them and develop a breadth and a wealth of knowledge so that I could take that and implement it in a way that felt in alignment for me. So I ended up doing a transitional year at Harbor UCLA and really enjoying emergency medicine. Ended up going to USC for a full family medicine program where I did Dr. Andrew Weil's program on integrative medicine. I went out into the world. I was doing some concierge, some, cannabis recommendations. I was doing full spectrum family medicine in a rural part of Arizona, doing the ER, admitting patients to the hospital, seeing them in the hospital, and seeing them in the clinic where I was the medical director. So during that process, I had made friends in the, I would call it the consciousness community through festivals. And one of those friends was Rick Doblin. And this was back in 2011. I saw him give a talk about MDMA, and I thought, this is fascinating. I want to be a part of this. And I had the gumption to ask for his contact information, and I stayed in touch with him through my residency. I told Rick, I'm going to Harbor UCLA next year. What do you recommend that I do? And he said, talk to Charlie Grove. Well, Charlie Grove's one of the world's most foremost ayahuasca researchers. So I show up at Charlie's desk as soon as residency begins with my list of questions. Hey, Charlie, what do you think about ayahuasca? What do you think about ayahuasca in children, in communities, preconception, as you were seeing it studied? What do you make of that? What do you think about ibogaine? And so Charlie and I had a great conversation. And when I finished residency, I called up Rick and I said, what should I do next? I'm committed to serving this goal. And he said, well, it's funny you reached out. A week from today, we're starting our very first MDMA assisted therapy training for our new study looking at its use in PTSD. And he said, if you show up, you can attend. And so I did. Kind of the rest is history, really. I didn't have a clinical trial at that time, but I met folks from New Orleans, including Sherry Taylor and Ray Worthy, who a couple years later reached out to me. I'll never forget the call. I was working an ER shift, and Sherry called me up and said, Maysa, we need a female therapist. I know that you have the training, but you don't have a clinical trial. And I said, when can I show up? So in true West Coast fashion, I showed up immediately, and it took probably another year to really get the ball rolling. And that's when I started helping them with the Compass Psilocybin trials, the MAPS MDMA trials. And we also started to work with ketamine. So what would happen is some of these participants were great candidates for the trials, but maybe had a couple of things that made the sponsors wary. They were screen failed. We would then say, hey, are you interested in pursuing ketamine assisted therapy? And so I slowly started to populate a ketamine practice. And eventually, one of those individuals was very committed to the cause and said, we need to bring this to the world. And she and I developed the practice I have now in New Orleans. And I retired from emergency medicine in 21 to commit to doing this. During that time, I met a couple folks from USONA. They said, hey, you should come work at USONA. 5 years later, I got a call from a recruiter. He said, we're looking for a medical director. The company is USONA. I said, sign me up. I got to know Chuck. I got to work on these beautiful programs. It's really been very serendipitous, Ale. And I think the key theme, again, is following your excitement and your passion, right? Without any necessary expectation of the outcome, because that can be so limiting. I would have never guessed all of this would happen without any, negativity towards it. So just keeping an open, positive mind, no matter how grim things look or how negative they may look, and then continuing to do that and repeat that process to keep following your excitement on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. And you exude that excitement. So
thank you.
let me ask, both of you, this idea, and I love this idea of, doing things from that enthusiasm and, kind of follow that. And yet we live a life, and particularly I take as MDs, is like, okay, we're going to give you this because this is what we expect. Is that expectation, does that hinder the results, or does it support the results? Chuck, let's start with you.
Well, what do you mean results, Ollie? Because it's interesting.
So let's say now you're doing all these great interventions to, we call it whatever, we go beyond the threshold or unlock the mind, or,
Yep.
so if if I go into a study like that and I'm thinking, I have this expectation that this will happen, is that supportive of that happening or hindering of that happening? Or does it matter?
Well, in the world of psychedelics, that's one of the $10 million questions. There are huge movements afoot within the sort of psychedelic research community to try to understand this, because the Food and Drug Administration is now very all worked up about this. Because psychedelics, people come into these with expectations. We don't know the answer to that question yet, and it's interesting because sometimes expectations can be very limiting, right? I mean, one of the classic things they say about psychedelic, which I think is true, is that you don't usually get the psychedelic experience you're expecting to have, and that's usually beneficial, but on the other hand, setting an intention probably does seem to be useful. Somebody that we work with, Annie Ortiz, has done some work with 5-MeO-DMT, which is a rapid acting psychedelic, suggesting that having an intention benefits your outcomes. I think it's also true, though, based. I was really intrigued by what you said about following your excitement. That this is a really true thing, I think, in life, right? It's like I didn't always understand what I was doing, but following the thread, you feel that there's something inside you that's pulling you that way. It's a very, very wise way, I think, generally to go through life. So it's interesting that you kind of articulated that also. And it's probably not unrelated to what you're asking, Holly, the sense of what you bring into something like a psychedelic experience is going to be impactful probably for what you get out of it. Mm-hmm. And it's the problem for pharma, because that's not how a pill is supposed to work. And so it's very interesting, the challenges of trying to bring psychedelics into this sort of buttoned up, uptight world of psychopharmacology.
Maysa, what do you think? Or what have you seen in the research?
Yeah, well, there is research showing that the investigator's opinion or belief about what happens influences it, right? No two energy bodies are independent of one in this, what we're considering a unified field, or what physics is showing us is really entanglement. So expectations are powerful, right? That's placebo effect. There's many documented cases where someone's cancer will resolve or some major condition will improve because they believe the pill or the thing that they're doing is going to provide them that outcome. At the same time, expectation can be extremely limiting, right? In my circumstances, if I had maybe kept my focus so narrow and thought that it could only go a certain way, right, I would be limited to the symphony of possibilities. So this is where meditation comes in, and it allows us to open ourselves to unlimited possibility. The work of Joe Dispenza has been very powerful for me, because the whole idea is to go to a place of no body, no person, no place, no time. So you can remove yourself from those expectations for even just a moment and allow something more curious or interesting to come through. So it's a nuanced question, Ale. And I think personally, as much as I try, I would like to be as open as possible to not having expectations. And yet I think it's part of our natural human condition, so to speak, that we do exert them, even subconsciously.
Totally. And actually in meditation, the same, right? That whether it's the text or whether it's the teacher that says this is what will happen with this. And so you're expecting, but usually what they say is that if you keep expecting, you're blocking the possibility of what may happen. Because what may happen is not just limited to what it says that may happen. There's more possibilities. And so in a way, it's both. It could be a good intention to have, and it might guide you in that, but it might either hinder or open. That's why I was wondering in this world, in the pharmacological world, what do you see? So let's get into some of the research that you both do. I don't know where you want to start. What I like to cover today is a little bit of both of your research in the psychedelic work. And then we'll talk a little bit about Dark Retreat. And Chuck and I have been dialoguing about this for years. And then see where it takes us. So who wants to start?
Basically, you want to talk about psychedelics? I mean, you've been
Sure.
up to your eyeballs
So
and stuff.
my experience with psychedelics is I joke that I have experienced every aspect of the psychedelic ecosystem except for working at the FDA, right? So the regulatory body itself. But I've worked on the sponsor side now at USONA, and that's the side of research that determines how the clinical study is going to go and funds it, chooses the sites. I've worked on the investigator side. So that's the site working with the participants and implementing the study and what's being requested. And I've worked in clinical. So having my own practice, working with patients directly, not only in a research setting, but also through the work with the ketamine, which is a legal psychedelic, so to speak, really would be classified as a dissociative anesthetic. But for all intents and purposes, we're using it for not only that, but for its ability to bring up whatever's coming up for somebody and needing exploration. And I think to put someone back into what's called a ventral vagal state, or a state of relaxed interconnectedness, and out of a fight, flight, or freeze state, which is where a lot of people are coming to us. So with regards to work on the sponsor side, with their USONA, so USONA has developed an intramuscular form of 5-MeO-DMT. This is a very powerful hallucinogenic psychedelic that's found naturally occurring in many trees, the Mimosa hostilis, root barks, and the parotid glands of the bufo and cilius toad in the Sonoran Desert. So USONA created a synthetic version of this and did the first ever in humans intramuscular phase 1 trial to look for the safety and figure out what it's doing. And then my goal at USONA has been to take that information from phase 1 and see how we can use it in order to potentially treat PTSD. So taking that data and information and saying, what is the methodology? How many sessions should someone get? What doses should be provided? Should there be, 2 doses, a singular dose? How would someone need to prepare for this kind of experience? How much processing or integration afterwards needs to be done? What are the risks? Who should and shouldn't be allowed? So everything in terms of the details of the clinical trial, I've had to think through and process and come up with what I think is the, best trial. So that's been very exciting and probably one of the most rewarding pieces of my work at USONA. On the other side, I'm also helping monitor the safety and the progress of the SIL 301 trial, looking at psilocybin for the treatment of depression. So this has been very exciting and interesting because we're seeing how safe and effective this medicine can be. We're also learning about what the risks are. Most of the risks with psychedelics in terms of psilocybin is related to suicidality, but in terms of effect on cardiovascular systems and otherwise, it's generally a very safe medication. And Chuck can probably speak more to this as well. He has been part of the phase 2 aspect of that, and then came in on phase 3. And then in terms of working on the investigator site side, getting to work with MAPS through the phase 3 clinical trials and sitting for individuals working through MDMA assisted therapy, I found that to be incredibly impactful. One of my participants to this day is a huge advocate for the medicine. He had a background in the military. When he came to us, he looked like a different person. I got to see him open and blossom and feel just the change that was taking place. You could even notice he had started to grow a beard, right? He started to think differently, and he really took the work very seriously. I had one client who had a little more difficulty knowing how to show up for the work and was a little more attached to her story. And I could see how, in that case, the medicine didn't give her the breakthrough that this other individual who seemed very committed to the work had gotten. And so I was able to see, some success and some stagnation with the psychedelics as well. So a very tempered experience. And with Compass work with psilocybin, it was exciting because now I'm working for the sponsor side. I don't get to see individuals get the medicine, but when I worked with Compass, I could see individuals on the medicine. And I remember distinctly one of my participants laughing hysterically and saying, "Oh, you're telling me this is one big, great cosmic joke," and on about this. This was in England. So he had this really, beautiful British accent. And the way he said it was like so witty and funny. And you could see the lightness in him. And he looked at me and said, like, I'm seeing like this beautiful, radiant figure. He was just so moved, and the connection was so profound, right? It made me realize just how deep these medicines can take the relationship between a practitioner and a participant, and how do you maintain those boundaries and the safety around that. And so in my practice with the ketamine work, it's been really fun. It's been really rewarding. It's very freeing. We are exploring a model of group integration and preparation and group ketamine. I think this is the model of the future where we can administer this medicine to as many people as possible in a safe container. We've done up to 17 in a group setting within a beautiful church space. I have my staff there. We're doing the blood pressures. We're doing the, and dual injections. Everyone's being checked on. There's live music with gong and didgeridoo. And we're going to integrate another layer of biometrics where an individual's Apple Watch or Oura Ring can affect the lighting. And as the group entrains and the heart rate variability changes, the lighting in the space will change to kind of mirror and reward that experience. So this to me is the most sustainable model for moving psychedelics forward, is a group model. And it's one that reflects the ancient cultural use of these medicines. It's not usually being done alone in those cultures. We're doing it for togetherness. And I'll tell you that the therapeutic process after these groups is way more integrated and connected than the individual therapy model. And the participants are connecting with one another. They're reflecting on each other's experiences. They're gaining more insight. They're feeling more comfort. They're building community, right? That's the number one predictor of longevity and health, is community. So it's interesting that in the research world, we haven't seen a study that's showing a connected model of group treatment. And that's what I'd like to put out in the research world, is can we start studying these molecules in a group environment and allow some of that excitement and uncertainty to come in, and might that affect our outcomes in a positive way, showing that these medicines are maybe intended to be used in that way.
Right. No, that is very important. I mean, and as we know in all the behavioral research, we know that just being in a group, there is a difference, even if the intervention is not there. So I think that is very important. And as you said, from the traditions themselves as well. Chuck, what do you have to add to that, or what do you want to bring into this part of the conversation?
No, I think that's right. It's very interesting. And people are, I have just reviewed a couple of studies where people are just at the beginning of trying to look at things as a group with a psychedelic. And yeah, it shows these really, positive results. It is interesting that we started this out as an individual thing when you think about it, isn't it? It was one of these things where that comes out of the early research in the 50s and the 60s, where within the sort of research they did it that way, and it got picked up that way, at Hopkins when they picked up all this in 2000. But yeah, and of course we don't. Group therapy is such a kind of cordoned off thing within standard mental health treatments. It's a thing, right? But it's not a psychopharmacologic thing. People don't take the Prozac together. My buddy Andrew Penn wrote this hilarious paper about the underground Prozac circles of the late 1980s. That's not how it was. And so it is interesting that I think without even thinking about it, we brought in, we imported in this sort of individual model. Group processes are more complex. There's some interesting. There can be issues with group models. There was and you probably see this, Ali, because meditation stuff is so often group related. There was a very famous large meditation, a shamatha study that was run in two groups, and they had radically different experiences. That one cohort had these hugely beneficial results. The other was a disaster. And it totally had to do with the dynamics within the groups. So there's a whole thing there, Maysa, interesting to study down the road, like trying to understand, can we look for predictors of when a group is going to work versus, go weird and sideways. But yeah, I mean, I think for a bunch of reasons, I think the group delivery of these agents is probably over time, if they get FDA approval, I think we're going to see it being more and more likely done. There's going to be two things that are going to happen, because the challenge with psychedelics is scalability, right?
Mm-hmm.
How can you do this at a cost that people can afford or that insurance would cover? Because if you got two clinicians in a room for 8 hours and all the psychotherapy, man, I mean, the MAPS treatment now, they're talking $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 for the treatment. Well, Prozac, generic Prozac's $5 a month. That's a steep hill to get over, right? So how do you make it potentially scalable? One way, and the pharma way for sure, is they're going to try to get rid of every possible kind of clinical element that they can, and just narrow it down to as much of it just being a drug as possible, right? So, and I've got colleagues that are very much committed few that I admire. But the little bit of prep and you get the dosing, somebody to kind of be watching you, and that's it, because that is potentially a way that costs could be cut. The other way it could be cut, and I think a more interesting way, is to do it in a group, which is really interesting, right? And that you could do it in a group, and it makes it much more financially viable. It makes it much more time frame, and it honors I have got a bias. I kind of favor the humanistic, consciousness-based understandings of these agents. I do, so I think that, but I think those two models are different. That's very interesting also, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all the ways that the field is fracturing, that's going to be a fracturing thing. So I think that'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I want to echo a point that you brought up, Chuck, and I think it's that we are fitting psychedelic research into the model of pharmaceutical single-use daily non-psychoactive drug research. And so the gold standard is a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. That is not the gold standard for psychedelic research, or it ought not to be, because we know about functional unblinding, in that when we give a psychedelic, you can't, you probably are going to know that you didn't get placebo, right? And it's hard to create the perfect active placebo, right? We tried niacin, and then FDA is like, no.
Yeah,
and low dose psilocybin, but it's still, there needs to be different standards for psychedelic research.
It's driving the FDA crazy, as we know, right? I mean, and there's huge movements afoot to try to figure out, God, there's got to be some way we can fit these agents into a standard randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. I mean, literally, it's very interesting. Ali, you made the point, I float around a lot of places, so I got big ears, and I hear stuff, and there's a huge movement afoot to try to figure this out. But you're right, Maysa. It's so that my thought experiment is, the perfect study would be, you'd give people something like 25 milligrams of psilocybin and some comparator that would produce an exactly identical psychedelic experience, but had no behavioral benefit. But if it's a psychedelic experience that creates the benefit, it's impossible, right? So the functional unblinding may be completely hooked up. Functional blinding meaning you're supposed to not know what you got, but you're seeing your dead grandma, so you figure you got the psilocybin. But that is consciousness, right? That is consciousness. And if consciousness is on the causal pathway, then so I do these kind of wacky studies in my life at UW, and the craziest of the studies that we're getting ready to do is we think, how to give people intravenous psilocybin while they're in deep sleep and without waking them up. And so we're using that as a model to say, well, if we give it to you while you're completely asleep, you're going to get all the direct biology, but you don't have an experience. It's like if a tree falls in the forest, nobody's there, doesn't make a noise, right? So if you have the full biologic stimulation, but you don't have an experience, does it still produce long-term benefits? We don't know, right? So I'm crazy enough to kind of want to test these things, but it directly related to this question of why these agents are so difficult to. But I will say one more thing, which is there was a recent big meta-analysis where they looked at all the studies, like 173 major FDA pharmaceutical trials of antidepressants. How many actually asked people to guess what they got? And the answer is only about 11 out of 173. So nobody asks. When they ask, people could totally guess whether they got an SSRI or a placebo, right? So it's a dirty little secret in psychiatric research that, in fact, we've been functionally unblinding, not as spectacularly, but we've been doing it forever. Psychedelics are sort of helping the field think about it.
Yeah, it's almost like the psychedelic research is being held to a higher standard. I mean, it is
absolutely
to a higher standard, more scrutiny, and
I want to bring back these things that you mentioned: humanity, gratitude, compassion. In our first study at MD Anderson with Lorenzo, we were meeting with Lorenzo and Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche. And actually Lorenzo asked Rinpoche, so if there was one thing that you want to measure, what would that be? And Rinpoche said, open-heartedness. And Lorenzo said, oh, wow, we can't measure that, but it's a great idea, right? So we still had it kind of for the long term. So now, we're using these different methods as a way of, we saying, unlocking the mind, or sometimes I hear going beyond the threshold, right, of our limitation of our intellectual mind that protects us, right? So what are the benefits of going beyond? And can we still be, as we go in that move beyond the threshold, can we still be contained and have the humanity, the compassion, and the gratitude? And how do we do that? How is it done as you guys do it?
You should tell us, Ali. I mean, you've got a lot more experience with because this is all highly real. I mean, but meditation poses all the same challenges, right? I mean, there's dangers in going beyond too, right? I mean, there's benefits and dangers, and psychedelics, I think, kind of tread that same pathway. But I don't understand. So you mean like what if you go beyond, you go into a space where you lose track of compassion and sort of warm-heartedness because you move into kind of, or what do you?
No, I think the opposite. So,
Yeah.
but I think there's a fear, right? I mean, a lot of people have fear of getting into like meditation, you are controlling it. You're,
Mm,
for the most part, right? And you do get into these states and you can decide in a way, do I want to
mm,
be open to that? Or sometimes we close ourselves to that. Now, with psychedelics, if we want to say, no, I want to stay, there's not that possibility. So
Yeah.
as you go into this journey, what are the, what's happened and how do you see the possibility of well-being and what is in a way the mechanism of helping with things like depression, for example?
mm.
Basically, you want to go first?
Sure. I think a lot of your question is about how to create safety and trust in the container in which the psychedelic is going to be used, because you're right, you can lose control. And if you're, they say set setting, but it's set setting and dose, right? There's also dose. So how do you, as much as you can, set up those three elements to ensure that this process of going beyond the mind is one that does not create harm and instead could create growth, beauty. And even if it does have a difficult element to it, how can that be structured in a way that's supportive of the mind? So reframing a narrative, right? I had a client who sat for a group event recently, and it took a lot of courage for her to go there because her trauma came from group events, and it came from medically oriented group events against her informed consent. So showing up to something like that, in her words, helped her reframe it because the experience was beautiful and the experience reminded her of safety. So she reclaimed a part of herself, and that trauma cycle created a resolution. So consent, right? As much as we can we prepare someone for what they could and maybe might experience so that they can say, all right, on some level of consciousness, I am accepting this possibility. It could go dark. It could be really uncomfortable. When someone agrees to that, there's a part of my knowing as a practitioner that they're more prepared for what might come, even if it is still difficult. So consent, safety, trust, setting, dose, and then let the mind go, right? Get outside of it and see what happens. And I think more often than not, when you have that preparation, you have the experience that, is going to happen, and then you make sense of it, or you help bring it into somebody's life through the integration afterwards. If you have that continuum, which I believe the studies at USONA are doing, you can create a safe container for this use.
Yeah, and that feeling for them that you're there for them, that you're
Right.
containing, you're supporting them.
Yeah, and from the practitioner standpoint, it is a lot of mental energy and effort. You're attentive. You're not sitting on your cell phone reading a book. And maybe in the implementation model there is some of that, but in the research we're present for you. And there might be two of us. I got to work in a male female, and few female dyad for our participants, and it's nice. It's nice as the space holder to have someone there, right? I need to take a bathroom break, or hey, I don't know what to say. And how to hold that space is a lot about not filling up the space with what you might want to say. We would write on our pages, WAIT, why am I talking? So the model of this is how to do psychotherapy without getting in the way, right? Someone's having an uncomfortable experience, or our gut instinct as therapists, healers, compassionate people is to make the pain go away. Oh, no, it's okay. Like breathe, it's about how can we sit with that discomfort and support someone through it so they can take their hero journey. I'm not here to fix that for them. And who's to say it even needs to be fixed, right? This is a lot of assumptions that we're making. We don't know what's happening for them. But what we can do is help be a source of grounding, support, safety, and allow them to work through whatever process needs to happen without us getting in the way.
Wonderful. I love that. I was thinking some of the similarities with dark retreat, right? So someone gets into the dark, um, and again, preparation, setting, dose, how many days are you going to be there? Do you plan that, and the support? Do you have someone, coming in, just checking in? How are you? What's going on? In some traditional set, many times it's okay. Are you doing your practice? Are you, and what's interesting, and Chuck and I have been actually working on this is, there is the traditional setting, and actually interesting enough, in the Tibetan tradition, it's 49 days, although they are, kind of micro, I just did one of 5 days. We're even thinking, what about one day? What about just being in a few hours? For some people, it could be a whole day. It's too much, right? It's like, what? And now even more, right? I'm not gonna have my cell phone, you know. And is it totally dark? I mean, is it, but these settings, in a way, when you are prepared, it's actually very relaxing, right? Because you're like, in a way, there's a sense of breaking through the usual world habitual patterns that we have in the world, and now in this setting, whether it's through a psychedelic, or now talking on dark retreat, you are in that you're on your own, and yet the importance of feeling supported there. Chuck, what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't say it better than you just did. I think that's right. I mean, we're always alone in our consciousness, right? I mean, even in a group consciousness, it just, at least in this realm, it inheres in individuals. And so, the interesting thing about dark retreat is you are alone. Nobody does group dark retreat, do they?
No, there's been, I have heard of people being kind of in a same cabin, but divided, kind of. I remember my teacher Namka Norbu Rinpoche was talking about one experience like that he had, and he could hear the person next door, and
Yeah.
What about in the Taoist tradition with student and teacher? I thought would be in the dark together, and maybe even more students. I know a lot of this was, in all the major religions, at least the influential figures or prophets took time in the dark in caves. I'm just wondering if students and teachers would like a meditative group.
Good question. Don't know.
yeah, or even go by themselves, right? I mean, supposedly
Yeah.
Jesus spent 40 days in the desert, right? Or these places of really, in a way, there's almost like cutting through the usual world, but to go beyond it, right? And in a way, when we think of mind, many times we think of mind here, but as we go beyond that, this is in the contemplative world, this is mind. And interesting enough, in the Tibetan tradition, at least in our tradition, this relates to space. So as you're here, space is infinite, right? Unbounded. So all the possibilities can be there. And as you are in that space, sometimes they call it more philosophically kind of emptiness, right? You could be grounded or you could be lost, right? So how do you ground in that experience? And in the dark, it's the same, right? You are
Yeah.
in, and you could get all into those things or not? And this might be an interesting question in how, what is the way that you talk to people going into this psilocybin or any of the, or ketamine. And so in the dark retreat or in meditation, usually we say all those things that arise, they're just in your mind. Don't worry about it. Whether it's the image of your teacher, whether it's, someone in your family, or whether it's a bad story that happened, they're all just stories. And as you let them go, you're more grounded in that inner space. How does that, are there similarities in those journeys?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, right? That's an interesting question in the world of psychedelics, because there are people who see psychedelics as primarily an ego dissolution process, that's what's valuable about them. So for instance, acceptance commitment therapy, when it gets applied to a psychedelic experience, the lesson is, wow, you just had this wild experience. And the goal of that is to see that it's all just thoughts in your head, a little bit like hallucinations in the dark, right? But there's another stream within psychedelics, which I personally suspect is probably more potent for many people, which is that in fact, they take those thoughts with extreme seriousness from the psychedelic experience. They have these unusual experiences that seem kind of hyper real. And if those experiences seem to provide them with a more effective or way of looking at their lives, or a more accepting way, or a broader way, that they really kind of hold on to the experience, right? It's almost the opposite, right? So this is really interesting, so the idea of the dark as the revealer of the insubstantiality of thoughts. Psychedelics can do that for people, but I think a lot of times it's a little bit different that way, where people then, like I say, they feel very, very bonded to the cognitive experience and the emotional experience they had while they're having the psychedelic experience. That's an area that's really ripe for kind of research for the sort of stuff we're interested in, and same with the dark, because it may be a difference. Although, it's interesting. I have a colleague here in town who went to Sky Cave, a woman, lovely woman, who's kind of an ayahuasquera. And her experience at Sky Cave was so profound. She said she'd never had that profundity with a psychedelic, and she hasn't done a psychedelic for a year or two, because she said there's, just that was it, So then, of course, I'm a sneaky guy. That's why I'm interested in these things. They're different, but they're pointing the same direction in ways I think are really, really valuable. And of course, I'm also interested, as you know, that in this idea of shorter periods in the dark. One of my fantasy studies is to try to figure out a way to do this in adolescence, to kind of first off, just to get them away from this, right? But to sort of, can we do this? What are the risks? What are the benefits? Can we do it? Can we do it as not as a group activity in the dark, but then can we do it as some sort of kind of initiation-y, kind of like for kids that are struggling with anxiety and depression? Can we explore the dark as a therapeutic modality? I have a little short list of studies that I'm most interested in doing, and that is at the top of the short list, because I do think that it's what you said, Maysa. The dose makes the poison, right? Or the dose makes the benefit. As with psychedelics, trying to understand different doses of darkness, I think, there's a real bunch of cool research we could do there.
Right. And I would say, can you prime someone for that more than just what you're saying about preparing them, but specifically with darkness? So serotonin is considered our primary happy chemical, right? Primary happy neurotransmitter. We'll add darkness and you get melatonin. So serotonin converts to melatonin. It's our nighttime serotonin through darkness. Now go a few chemical reactions beyond and you get DMT. This is the most powerful hallucinogenic that we know and we have within ourselves. So how can we get someone primed to be used to higher and higher doses of their own melatonin before we flood them with darkness? And might that be predictive of a more positive outcome rather than one of these reactionary, has a horrible experience?
Too much.
Exactly. So I don't know if you remember last time we hung out, Chuck, I had these orange glasses on.
Oh, yeah.
So I was blocking artificial blue light, which there's a lot of, and you can block more and more of it throughout the day to prepare yourself for sleep and increase your melatonin. And, you know, I have concerns about all the new age lighting with LEDs and a lot more blue light from screens coming in, because it's naturally dampening our melatonin. And melatonin is our most powerful antioxidant that we make in our bodies. So you can see alternative cancer treatments have high dose melatonin as part of those treatments often. You know, people take it for sleep to help, you know, create more of it essentially when they're deprived. And I think a lot of people with mental health issues are struggling with sleep. So chicken or the egg, right? Is this a melatonin DMT problem? Serotonin, melatonin, DMT, it's all interconnected. So I would wonder if these teenagers went on a regimen of using the blue blocking glasses progressively and started to cut down on screen time before one of these dark retreats, if they would have an easier time going through it, because darkness brings up some of the most primordial human fear that we know, right? My daughter the other night was like, the skin crawler is in the dark. He's going to get me. I'm like, who told you what skin crawler? She gives this elaborate explanation of some monster some kids have told her about. And now she's starting to see it in the dark, right? She's already got more melatonin than probably all of us. So it's more potent. It's more real for her. But, you know, kids are afraid of the dark. There's something to that. I think that's important when we start to work with that age group, with teenagers, how to set them up for success in a psychedelic experience, even though it's not psilocybin or DMT, right? It's their own DMT.
For me, the dark was the doorway into the practices. I had what I called existential attacks, and they were always in the dark. I would wake up in the middle of the night sweating, and I'll be like, I'm going to die. And then what?
Oh, wow.
You know, and that's what actually led me into this. But you were talking about sleep, Mesa, and Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche is now really doing a lot, almost like, as he says, obsessed about sleep and the importance of that, and really saying we need to spend more time in bed and prepare, be 9 hours in bed, and just, you know, as you get there, it's not just go as you're tired and then just gone, but actually kind of prepare, do your breathings, do your practice.
Right.
And when you probably wake up around 3 or 4 in the morning, of course, don't look at anything else. Just maybe if you need to go to the restroom, go, but then go back to sleep. Maybe do these breathings of 4 in, 8 out, and just rest, 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 right? And as you do, even when you wake up, that there's, you know, if you can, and if you have the time, stay in bed. And that time also, you know, again, it's supported by the darkness. He's also, you know, have a mask, you know, keep, and as you in that resting, maybe also another aspect that we didn't get to talk, but it's related, it's the dreams, right? And the dreams and that visions that may come, and how again you relate to that and how they support, because it's also again part of unlocking the mind, that consciousness and unconscious that unlocks, and what are the benefits of that? So I know we're coming to the, but I wanted to get now to some of those. What are the aspects of well-being that
Mm.
you see in these practices, and what, where should we move forward?
I think you hit on it, Ale. I got an aura ring, I want to say 3 or 4 months ago. I have learned that sleep is the most important predictor of my well-being on all aspects. My mood, my readiness, my, you know, feminine cycle. If I'm not getting good sleep, all of that is subject to, you know, dis-ease. So how do you know if you're getting good sleep? It's interesting that algorithms are looking at your lowest heart rate through the night, when that occurs, and that can determine your chronotype or when it's ideal for you to sleep. Because remember, back in early societies, there'd be people to have night watch. They were the night watchers. And probably genetically through the years, their family continued to be night watchers. So when I have, you know, an office manager who's like, I am a night watcher, I'm on that chronotype, I'm like, yeah, don't worry, come in at whenever you need to. So she starts her day at 1, noon or 1, right? Not every work environment is that adaptable or understanding, and everyone has a different chronotype. So it's important to get in tune with that. For me personally, it's been very eye-opening and very insightful. And so I'll know when I wake up what my sleep was like the night before, my approximated readiness score, and then it adjusts my activity level based on that to say, hey, you don't need to hit it so hard today. Take some rest. And another thing that you mentioned, Ale, was don't just go straight to sleep, right? Have a wind down practice. To me, I thought, why would I relax before going to bed? Going to bed and sleeping is my relaxation. And I found that to be a very misguided approach, that really the winding down process helps one to achieve deeper sleep, better sleep, and more relaxation during sleep than if you just go straight to bed. And part of that wind down for me is very much related to the light that I take in, the information that I take in. I don't take in food late at night, right? How do I set myself up to have the ability to just focus on sleeping while I'm sleeping and not digestion, the news, just like hormonal disruption from the lights? I really think it comes down to sleep. I do. And it's true. In depressive disorders, people have different sleep from what you would consider the norm, right? Different sleep latency, less REM. Cannabis affects REM. It's so interesting that these medicines are working on sleep, I think, on a foundational level. That's why I think it's important to add these biometrics to the clinical trials we're doing to see what is actually the physiologic adjustment of the process that's maybe happening from these medicines. And maybe when we stop losing benefit of sleep is when you need to redose with them. Maybe that's something we can easily measure as a correlate to sleep.
Interesting. Chuck?
Ali, I'm interested in what you were saying. It's so interesting. I'm interested, this idea of what would the thought of, Tension Wangyo about the sleeping? Is it sort of what Maysa was talking about, or is it something else? What's the interest in spending more time in bed? Because I think this, when I've got a sticky mind when I hear something that's new, that's interesting to me.
So the more time in bed, there's also you get to sleep more, and you get all your deep sleep. You have more opportunities to have deeper sleep. You have more opportunities to have REM. And what he always says is, and don't try to go to sleep. What you do is rest. So, even when you do these naps in the afternoon, what do they call them? Cat naps. It's not about napping necessarily. It's about resting. Just this concept of resting, I think it's really important, because if you think of rest, this is in a way you're getting familiar, and the word for meditation, gom, is related to familiarity, gom, and it's familiarity with that resting state, right? And as you're doing it in meditation, you're doing it in sleep, and so the whole point is, how can we rest? And even I think when we are using this different methods, is yes, it kind of gets us, we think of the non-rest, but after we kind of break that barrier, that's right. I think it is about resting and staying. And I think, Maysa, you were saying the sense of container, if they can just stay and rest and kind of watch, experience, feel, but from that resting space, I think there's more nourishing there. There's more possibilities of well-being. I don't know.
That's really well said. That's really interesting. Yeah, and of course, dreams. Much of the stuff that I've looked at kind of comes out of the Tibetan tradition. This sort of, what are these ways that were hit upon for developing these sort of mental states that we're interested in, and of course, dream yoga is a really interesting thing. I probably won't be around long enough to get all the way down that road, but it is very interesting that then can you use sleep again in sort of intentional ways that might be used. That's an area that is really interesting. If you look at mental health, we just worry about, well, are you sleeping or not? But these questions of, can you do things? I'm older, and like older people, I wake up in the middle of the night and then I do exactly what you described. Sometimes I get the existential, but a lot of times I just start worrying, thinking about every bad thing that could happen. So I've been trying to do what you sort of described, of doing sort of meditative breathing, but also sort of watching, and then watching, when do those thoughts give way to sleep? Where's that magic hypnagogic moment, where instead of thinking it, you start seeing it, and can what can be done with it? I'm really, again, this is an example of things coming out of your life, given that I have these experiences, I've gotten really interested in whether I could do something more with them. And is there anything there that can be, mind is the wrong word, but, can we learn something from this that could then become part of a more holistic way of helping folks? Because you're right, man, middle of the night, that is depression, right? Depression, and it's that 3 a.m. If you've ever been depressed, you know exactly what it is, and are there things that we could do with that?
Mm.
Are there things we could do with it, not just to make it go away, but to work with it, to leverage it? That would be more of a psychedelic kind of, right? I don't know. I've never thought about that until this moment, actually. It's a new thought, but interesting.
Well, I wanted to ask you, and you started with this, you mentioned gratitude and your work with Geshe Lobsang and compassion. I wonder if when we are in those states of kind of we wake up and our mind, a sense of compassion for ourselves, finding what are we grateful for, I find that that helps. Um, Anything that, I mean, and I haven't done the training with Geshe Lobsang, but I've heard so much about it. Beautiful. And are there things there that that you can mention about maybe having more compassion to yourself or compassion to the situation or something that supports, again, our well-being?
Yeah, sure. And I think this goes back to that idea of mental states that allow grief, but that don't that sort of protect against this sort of there's a thing in depression. It's got a certain self-focus and a certain kind of toxic flavor to it that these sort of more, I don't know what to call them, like transcendent mental states tend to make it very difficult to be in that darker, that depressively darker space. Absolutely, this idea that because compassion, that is an outcome of these sort of states too, right? And so this question of whether the practices put you into those states is a really interesting one. I think it's really interesting, and whether they could be used at night. I don't know. I never thought of this before. This is how I get ideas, though. Down the road, if I get a funder and a place to take it out for a drive, this is like I literally keep a list of these sorts of ideas, and I'm always watching for the moment to say, is there a way we can actually ask that question and look at it? Because it's a very interesting idea. Because this middle of the night business is such a depression thing, right?
Mm.
And we just try to make it go away, but could something be done with it? And if it was, what would it be? That's a really interesting idea.
Great.
Yeah.
Maysa,
My instinct. I'm sorry, go ahead, Al.
no, I was gonna say, yeah, I was gonna ask you, and where does that aspect of gratitude, compassion come in
Yeah.
for you?
Yeah. Wow, compassion. I think, I knew Chuck and I were going to get along when I saw a photo of him with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, because I had just taken a similar photo just a year ago in May when I went to India for the first time. I went to Dharamshala, where, our Tibetan exiled brothers and sisters are living, and His Holiness has been living for some time. And it overwhelmed me, the experience. I could feel that compassion. It was so palpable. And one of my emotional detox methods or way of converting emotion is crying. I'm a crier. I was crying before this call. I'll probably cry afterwards. So I just started crying. And I think people around me were moved by that because I was so moved. So compassion is contagious, right? And if we allow ourselves to, or have the opportunity to fully feel it, I think it just spreads by its nature. So it's about, for me, being around someone who has cultivated that and embodied it and then tapping into it or feeling it. In this case, I didn't really have to do much. It hit me like a ton of bricks, right? And the music, the women singing, the children, like young girls singing at the high pitch. The song they sang was, welcoming Avalokitesvara, the reincarnate of compassion. So it was like everything in that moment built. Everyone's standing. They're all looking for, oh, there he is. He's coming from the elevator. There's people assisting him right now in his older age, which there's something to be said for him in his older age now, right? That boisterous, younger, talkative Dalai Lama is now really refined in a way, right? He doesn't have to say a thing. He does not say a thing, right? He raises his hand in this way, and it's just like, and everyone is overwhelmed or overcome by it. So I
Yeah.
think, I've taken a vow to compassion. He initiated us as bodhisattvas during this teaching event I was at, and unexpected to me, and was like, yeah, I'm here for this. I'm here for compassion. Like, let me reintegrate my form and my energy as long as it takes to be the full embodiment of compassion. So really, yeah,
This is
yeah,
now that he's turning 90. There's a commemorative birthday edition. It says the Dalai Lama, champion of wisdom and compassion.
yeah.
And I have the same experience of what you said, of crying. And I love what you said of compassion being what do you call contagious, right? But the what's important is, I feel, is we need to be open our heart to allow ourselves to contage from compassion. And
Mhm.
most of the times we're not. So maybe through this and through ketamine, all the things that you have, maybe it is about, as Rinpoche was saying, being more open-hearted and being allowed in that open-heartedness to being allowed to be contaged by compassion. So thank you both. This has been wonderful. I love our interaction. I hope we can do more and maybe be in the same physical space and share more. So thank you, Mesa. Thank you, Chuck. Um, Thank you, Milos, for hosting. For those in Cyber Sangha, thank you. And just letting you know a couple of events coming up on July 3rd. Marcy will be leading a practice on embracing refuge with guided meditation. And July 10th is our next full moon. And for those who don't know, we start at 10 a.m. New York time, and we go till 9:45 a.m. of the next day. And we do that because otherwise Zoom closes us. So that's why we do 23 hours and 45 minutes. And so we have all the different parts of the world joining, and then at the end, this dedication of compassion, right? Of releasing the suffering of all beings and the causes of suffering. So,
Mhm.
and bringing hopefully this intention of happiness and the causes of happiness.
Mhm.
Thank you both. This has been wonderful. I appreciate it. And yeah, all best. Let's be open to be contaged by compassion.
Amen.
Yes. Thank you,
Okay.
Ale.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Ali.
Doug.
Bye bye. Yeah, good to
Bye.
talk.
Right?